This is the Sony FX30 and it is virtually identical both physically and in terms of specifications to this, which is the Sony FX3. This FX30 uses an APS-C size sensor, whereas the sensor of the FX3 is full frame, and that makes a big difference when it comes to price. The FX30 costs £2,600 with the audio handle and just £2,100 body only, compared to almost £4,000 for the FX3, which comes with the audio handle as standard. Now, I'm going to leave the physical differences between these two cameras until the end of the video, because the changes are so small, they're virtually insignificant. So the headline specs of the FX30 are the same as the FX3. The camera can shoot 4K footage at up to 120 frames a second. We've got full HD footage at 240 frames a second, and we've got 10-bit 422 at 60 frames a second. Now, importantly for image quality, the camera uses a full 6K resolution that's available to its sensor, and then it downsamples that to the 4K image. Now, the result is that there should be more detail and should be less noise, particularly in those shadow areas. There is a caveat to that though. To get that downsampled image, you have to be shooting in 4K at a frame rate of less than 60 frames per second. Now, the sensitivity range is also different as a result of the sensor, with the range of the FX30 being ISO 125 to 32,000, compared with the standard range of the FX3 being ISO 80 to 102,400. Now, both these cameras have two card sockets that can take either CF Express Type A or SD cards. Now, you can also take advantage of external recording via the full-size HDMI port on the side of the camera there. And when you're using a compatible external recorder, that means you can capture 16-bit raw footage from the FX30. There are 3.5mm microphone and headphone sockets on the side of the camera. Now, the audio interface handle adds two XLR mic inputs, then you've got the relevant gain controls for each channel. Now, one feature that the FX30 has that the FX3 doesn't is focus breathing control. The camera features image stabilization. We've got it in camera, and obviously it can combine with optical stabilization on any compatible lenses. Using those two will smooth out any small shakes, but if you really want to lock off the image for more tripod-esque stabilization handheld, then you'll want to use the active stabilization. Now, this obviously crops in slightly and then moves the area of the sensor that's being sampled to keep that recorded image as still as possible. And I found it works impressively well. Now, another advantage of an APS-C size sensor is that the lenses designed for it are usually smaller and lighter, which works perfectly well with the small size of this camera body. However, when you use a full frame lens, you also get that kind of 1.5 effective change in the field of view. So I tested this with my Sigma 100 to 400mm lens, which at the longest point of that lens becomes a 600mm equivalent if it were on a full frame camera. It gets even more ridiculous if you use the FX30's clear image zoom, which allows you to increase that to 1.5 times to create equivalent of a 900mm field of view on a full frame camera. Now, I tried supporting that using just the monopod with the active stabilization turn on. Now, Sony don't actually recommend you use the active stabilization over 200mm because, as I find, the results were a bit jittery. But I feel there's a real opportunity here to use some of those longer telephoto lenses with this camera. The creative opportunities for wildlife photographers shooting video using this smaller, lighter camera and some smaller telephoto lenses, there's a lot for them, I think, that they can get from the FX30. Now, to be honest, I wasn't expecting much. I was really pushing the camera to see what it could do, more for fun than anything else. But I was really impressed that the FX30 was still able to use animal eye AF. It was tracking a deer that I was filming, And it wasn't just a one-off. There were various shots I was framing and I could see the little rectangle over the eye of the deer. It's clearly working really well, even with these third-party lenses. Now, Sony recently announced firmware version 2 for both the FX3 and the Alpha 7S3. And perhaps the standout addition was the ability to load LUTs into these cameras. The FX30 basically runs the same firmware as these two cameras. And as you would expect, you can also load LUTs onto this. Now, for me personally, that's a game changer because I'm not experienced at shooting and exposing S-Log video footage, and I'm certainly no expert when it comes to color grading. So to be able to find a LUT from a filmmaker, from Sony's own website, they've started putting some on there, or from some, a creator on YouTube, or even designing my own in something like Lightroom using some plugins, all of a sudden I can take that LUT, I can load it straight into the camera, and I can get perfectly kind of exposed footage and then drop it straight on my timeline without having to grade. Alternatively, you can just preview the LUT. So you're still getting your S-Log footage and you can put the LUT on when you're editing the footage afterwards, but you can preview for exposure and things like that in camera. Now, if you're not interested in doing that, there's always just Sony's S-Cinetone, which produces nice kind of cinematic looking footage, which you can just tweak ever so slightly to your needs when you come to editing without having to do a full color grade to log footage. Now, as you would expect, the camera is capable of shooting slow motion footage, and this is very simple to do. You can either record at 100 frames per second or 120 frames a second, then slow that footage down when you're editing it on the timeline, or you can use Sony's slow and quick S&Q mode. Now, this mode will also effectively allow you to shoot time-lapse style footage by really slowing down the number of frames per second you can record. One of the more unusual things I did with the camera was to use it remotely. I set up a small reflection pool in the garden to film some garden birds. Then I connected the camera directly to my laptop using Sony Imaging Edge desktop software. I could then be working away in the house, looking at the monitor, my laptop screen, and start and stop recording every time a bird landed. I could even change exposure settings and things like that. Now, before I give you my quick overview, initial impressions, let's see if you manage to spot all of the physical differences between the two cameras. Now, let's start with a really obvious one. One of them, obviously, says FX3, whereas the other one, we've got FX30. Now, next up, the FX3 says full frame just underneath the lens mount there, whereas the FX30 obviously doesn't. The 5 3/4-inch threads are black on the FX30 and they're just bare metal on the FX3. So next up, the FX30 doesn't have an infrared remote sensor on the hand grip. There is one on the FX3 just there. And finally, and this one is really tiny, if you look just here, just where my finger is, you will see there is a single white sensor just there, whereas on the FX3, there is both a sensor and an LED. So they've removed the little LED light that acted as the self-timer, and on the FX30, the tally light actually does that flashing countdown if you're using the self-timer on the camera. And that's it. That's the Sony FX30. It's a camera that seemed odd at first, perhaps a downgrade from the FX3, but an expensive camera when you compare it to the likes of the Sony Alpha 6000 APS-C range. However, this is something completely different. It's aimed at serious content creators, filmmakers, those who want to really take their footage away from the usual vlogging cameras and take that first step on a more advanced filmmaking journey to produce higher end cinema content. Now, of course, you can take that step on a camera that is cheaper and with fewer features. But this is now the entry point to Sony's cinema line, and that's a lineup of cameras that many users aspire to use and to own. Now, the FX3 opened that line up to a lot more people, but the FX30 has a significant reduction in price, and it reduces that barrier to entry even further, particularly when you also factor in the cost of APS-C lenses. It promises to be a really great camera, and I'm looking forward to getting my hands on it again in the future and really putting the image quality and some of those more advanced features to the test.